Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back for my LCK week number 6 overview and analysis video. We're really getting a better idea of where these LCK teams start to sit. We might even see some teams qualify for the playoffs already. We're getting closer and closer towards the back half of the regular season. Of course, the LCK regular season is the one that goes the latest, and so we're still kind of in the middle, considering everything that happened with the Esports World Cup, but we're definitely going to get some more clarity this week. A lot of teams that are around each other in the standings are going to be facing off, and we'll definitely get a better idea of where each team is sitting by the end of the week. I hope you guys are excited. You know I am. If you want to know my thoughts on the LCK up until this point, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. Every single week of the LCK is going to be overviewed in the same format as this one in that video there. So go ahead and check it out if you are interested in my analysis of the weeks before this, but the rest of this video will just be going over week number 6. Of course, we'll talk about some interesting things that have happened because of this week at the end of the video, but if you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the video, talking about what teams I think are moving up and what teams I think are moving down, if there are any changes at all. There have been quite a few weeks, not only here in the LCK, but basically in every region where I've just not made a lot of changes. There really haven't been a ton of upsets across this split so far. It's still been an interesting one, though, in terms of gameplay. So we'll talk about why I think some teams are really starting to emerge, or why some teams could potentially be in the playoff race that maybe weren't expecting it. But all of that is for the end of the video. We have to start going series by series with day number 1. And I'm excited to talk about this day number 1 series, or at least the first one here, because it really did start to illuminate how good this team actually is. It's Nongshim RedForce taking on FearX, and Fox once again picks up yet another 2-0 win. They are clearly better than the bottom of the standings. They are much closer to being a team like the Kwangdong Freecs than they are to being anybody in the bottom 3, and that's massive for Fox. They're now sitting at 5 and 6, depending on how things go the rest of this week. They could potentially get into the playoff spots, quote-unquote, top 6 by the end of the week, and that's massive for a team that really didn't feel like they were anywhere near playoff contention, not only at the beginning of this split, but especially at the end of last split, when we were talking about how they finished out the spring. They ended up making some changes. Raptor came in to replace Willer, a pretty controversial decision. People are still relatively, upset with that, and I've been somebody who has said that, Willer is a really good player, and Raptor is a pretty good player, that Willer would certainly make this team better, but Raptor doesn't make this team worse. I'm still kind of on that bandwagon, because I just think Willer is really solid, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves, but Raptor has been much better for this team than he is getting credit for. He has also been essentially what Willer was last split for them. I think they're relatively equal in terms of skill level, but really the emergence of Clear in the top lane has been what has pushed Fox over the edge. He's going to get player of the series here in the top lane. Clear is one of those interesting players, right? Super highly touted prospect coming out of the Challengers League, was in the DRX system, was talked about as a potential superstar coming in the top lane, never really materialized. He just came in and was super inconsistent in lane, wasn't a particularly good team fighter, and just had quite a few problems on, up and down FearX teams, and you really just wanted to see some more game-to-game consistency from a player that obviously does have the mechanics to be relevant at this level. It took him some time, but as we've seen pretty consistently throughout his career up until this point, he does get better as the split goes along. He did that last year as well. When you talk about the summer split when he was inserted over a Bertle, he ended up being better, I would say, by the end of the year. That was kind of the case for spring. He ended up getting better kind of week over week. Hopefully that ends up being a continuous pattern, because he's actually playing really well right now. The last 2 weeks of Clear have been really good, and so if he's going to be able to maintain that level of form, then FearX is actually going to be pretty dangerous. That Renekton game in game 1 was awesome. Like, it was really, game-breaking. So, big ups to Clear. Like I said, Raptor also playing incredibly well. The brand was just absolutely dominant in game number 2. When that champion starts to get rolling, it's basically impossible to stop. I still think he's the hardest snowball champion in the game right now, and Raptor definitely went and proved that. Sylvie has had trouble being able to stop very aggressive junglers, and that's what Raptor is. People talk about Willer because he was kind of the tone setter for FearX in terms of, what this team was at the beginning of the year. Raptor is the exact same style of jungler, and whether you want to argue that Willer is better at it or not is up to you, but Raptor is not a tone shift for FearX. He is the same kind of guy who's going to come out and want to flip games early. He's either going to win or lose you the game by 20 minutes will be the primary focal point for FearX, and that continues to be a good thing because I think it moves everybody else down in the order. Closer, who is a player I've really disliked as a potential number 1 or number 2 option on, an actual good team, has really stepped up and been kind of the number 3 option on this team throughout the entirety of the split. They can rely on either Clear or Hanwha to be the number 2 on any given game, whoever they want to put resources into, and Closer can kind of fill the gaps. Raptor, of course, being the number 1 for this team in terms of resources most games. Closer really fits into that role. That's where I think he is going to shine, is as somebody who can be an ancillary piece on one of the better teams. Honestly, the role that I think would be a dream for him would be something like what Cream is doing on Top Esports in the LPL right now, where he's just got these really dominant laners around him. 369, Jackie Love, Tian is playing really well. Cream's job becomes a lot easier because all he really has to do is stay alive. I think Closer could fill a pretty similar role in a lot of teams to that. I don't think he's as good as Cream is, but he has certainly been consistent over the course of this split, which was his biggest problem for the last couple of years. Hanwha and Duro are also really solid. Right now, Duro has been nothing but a massive upgrade in the support position. Execute was, quite frankly, just not good enough to play in the LCK. It saddens me to say that, but that's the truth. Duro has been excellent for this team, and Hanwha has really stabilized. And so FearX kind of in a decent position, and Nongshim, not so much. I mean, I'm not going to freak out about this team. They're probably the best of the rest, if you will, the best of the bottom 3. That's not really saying much. Jiwoo is just that good, and he's going to create opportunities that are that strong. The rest of this team is just not consistent enough in order to actually do anything. Mihail is going to get dud of the series. Still like Mihail, still think he's more valuable right now than Din, who just was doing nothing on the top side, but he is going to lose in lane sometimes when he faces somebody that's really mechanically talented. It just doesn't seem like he has the consistency yet to be able to overcome those problems. I still think he could be a pretty good player, but when he loses, he does lose pretty hard. Sylvie also just continues to be kind of whatever in the jungle. I'm just kind of out on him individually as a player. I really liked him in the Challengers League, but at some point you have to show something. At the LCK level, he's just not been able to do that. Even Jiwoo and Guger, I thought were up and down this series. Fisher continues to just be sometimes he's good, sometimes he's bad. This was one of the more middle-of-the-road series that he's had, but generally I just need to see more game-to-game consistency. Nongshim is not really all that worth talking about, just because we know exactly what they are. They're not a playoff team, but they're probably not the worst team in the league either. You have some interesting pieces. Hopefully some of these young players start to, use this experience to get a little bit more consistent, but as of right now, like, they're going to be a 3, 4, 5 series win team across this split, and they're not going to be anywhere near top 6 because of that, but FearX is. They are going to be competing for a playoff spot, and that's massive for them. If they get into playoffs, they are very likely going to get into the season finals, the qualification for Worlds, and anything can really happen in a tournament like that. They're playing the best league they've played all year right now, and it's a really good time to do so. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's kind of a stomp, but a very expected top versus bottom stomp. Gen.G taking on OK BRION, and Gen.G picking up the 2-0 series win. They moved to 11-0 to start this split. Domestically, they moved to 22-1 in terms of game score domestically to start this split. It's just been a level of dominance that we have never seen. I've already talked about it. Losing 1 game, let alone 0 series through the first round robin of the LCK is genuinely one of the most impressive accomplishments of all time. Like, this Gen.G team, regardless of what ends up happening at the end of the year, regardless on if they figure things out and, end up going on to dominate Worlds in the way that they should, or if they, aren't able to win Worlds, regardless of the outcome, this is one of the most dominant teams ever. And we're going to be looking back on them for a long time as one of the most dominant teams ever. And in that context, this is an obvious result. Like, no one is surprised to see them come out and beat Bro. I think the only shocking thing is that Bro didn't randomly upset the best team in the league. They seem to do that at least once every single year. They have yet to do it so far in 2024. So, unfortunately, it won't be Gen.G that ends up falling to Bro. Maybe they have their powers for somebody else at the moment, but Gen.G is just unstoppable. Like, there's just nothing else to say. Even their biggest quote-unquote issue in the spring split was their inability to play through bot lane, or at least their lack of desire to want to play through the bot lane. Even that is not necessarily the case anymore, and they're doing that in a meta where bot lane is probably the least valuable lane to invest in terms of early game resources at all right now. You're not playing a ton of hyper carries. It's mostly like self-sufficient, Ezreals and Ashes and, Jins and things like that, and Paze is still being able to get set up to carry games for this team. Paze is going to get player of the series. He is maybe playing better right now than he has in his whole career. People have been talking, I think individually, he's been getting quite a bit less help than he was getting last year in summer. I still think the output in summer last year was definitely better. He was my MVP last summer, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that he's definitely been better than he was in 2023 summer, but 2024 summer has also been an incredibly good split so far for him. He's been able to step up 2v2 and just kind of dominate laning phases. He's been incredibly efficient in the mid to late game. The Ezreal in game 1, like that's a Korean Ezreal if I've ever seen one. Just absolutely dominated the game. He looks great. You know, playing with Lehens certainly helps. Lehens just makes everybody he plays with look better. That's been the case for especially the last 3 years. That's really where I think Lehens has figured it out and kind of locked in ever since he came to Gen.G for the first time. He has really like just become one of the best supports in the world, gotten a bit more consistent, hasn't, you know, really been making as many of those negative plays that he was making in 2021 as consistently. So generally I love this bot lane, and obviously Envy and Polu were not good enough to be able to keep up. Keen, Canyon, Chovy, all looks great. Canyon 2 games of Maokai. They've been putting him on tank duty the last couple series, and he looks fine. This is something he struggled with on DK, and so he's already looking better in terms of how he's playing initiators and tanks and things like that on this Gen.G team. That's not surprising. Keen is just dominating everybody in the top lane. He might be the best top laner in the world right now. Chovy is the best player in the world, let alone the best mid laner in the LCK, so you're really not worried at all about Gen.G. There's just not a lot of analysis left to give. The only thing I can say is that even Pays is starting to get better game over game over game, and that is the biggest problem for teams that want to beat Gen.G, because there's no longer any lane that ends up being a problem for them. So congrats to Gen.G, but for Bro, I mean, 1 in 10, this isn't shocking. They are who we thought they were. You know, insert meme here. People were freaking out because Bro got their first win last week. They ended up not going winless across this split. I think that's awesome for them, but this team just does not have the talent to be able to carry that into multiple other wins. Youngjae was back in this series. I think that that is an upgrade in the jungle. Of course, couldn't play against KDF because he is loaned in from KDF, but he is definitely someone that should try to stabilize because he's the only good player on this team right now, or at least he was the only good player in this series. He tried his best on the Sejuani to create some options in the bot lane, in the mid lane, in a lot of different areas. The team just wasn't good enough to be able to win with the resources that they were able to get in the early couple minutes. They ended up just folding in the mid game. And there's just not a lot you can do about that. As Sejuani, there's not a lot of ways to rectify that situation, so I don't blame him. People were really excited when Fate came in last week because he was so good in their series win. You know, Fate's a decent player. I think he's somebody that could be a middle-of-the-road mid laner, an average mid laner at the LCK level for a better team. I don't think he's going to continue to perform like a middle-of-the-road kind of mid laner for this team. I just don't think that they have the support setup to be able to enable him to be good, but as the #1 option on this team, potentially he could do something. Unfortunately, this bot lane is just too problematic. Envy is going to get dud of the series here in the bot lane. Polu is definitely in contention for it. There's really not a lot to say. They're not good. Envy and Polu have not been good across this entire split. There has yet to be a time where really either of them have been able to step up and prove that they're LCK level in any capacity. Polu in particular, I think, has really struggled at this level. It's just not been able to find any sort of footing connecting with the rest of the team. But Envy doesn't help with that. His laning has actually been pretty atrocious, and even when he is handed quite a bit of gold like he was in game #1 on the Zeri, he just does absolutely nothing with it, which is why he is the one that is going to get dud of the series for me in this one. Again, I think you could give it to either member of the bot lane, but this was a bot gap. At the end of the day, that was the most noticeable difference between these two teams. Envy and Polu have been one of the worst, if not the single worst bot lane in the LCK, and Pays and Lehens are finding the best form that they've been in all year long. It's just not a good situation for Bro, and they got exposed here. Morgan was also a bit of a problem on the top side. Honestly, Morgan has just not been good across this split. I'm a Morgan fan for the most part. I thought he was really good in spring, probably had his best split ever in spring, but he has not carried that momentum at all over into the summer split. It has been a bit of a disaster for him, so hopefully things can get figured out in some way, shape, or form for him individually so that he can, you know, salvage some of that reputation, perhaps get on a different team next year. I think there is talent on this team, but the bot lane is inevitably going to hold them back. I think top lane has been a bit of a negative for them, and that's why they are clearly the worst team in the LCK, and they just went and proved that again here. But it's Gen.G. Losing to Gen.G is not the worst thing in the world. This team is beating everybody. They are essentially untouchable domestically right now, and I don't really see any reason for that not to just continue. Then moving on now to day #2, and another pretty predictable outcome, especially with how this team has played. Recently, it was the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE is going to pick up the dominant 2-0 series win. They were the better team by far in this one, and that's not a surprise to anybody who has watched either of these teams play over the past 2 weeks in particular. HLE has really found their groove. They've been on a massive win streak, and they are in one of the best positions in the LCK right now. I moved them up to #2 in my power rankings last week. I think there is a potentially very good shot that this team ends up making finals. I'm not going to try and predict that because T1 is, one of those teams that you always expect to figure things out. But at the moment, HLE has definitely looked like the second best team. Them and, Dplus KIA are trading over that spot. So it's not a surprise to see them winning. And for KDF, it just seems like they get worse week after week after week. And that's not just like a recent thing. That has been an organizational failure for quite a long time where this team just doesn't seem to finish any split strong. They really kind of collapse in the middle of every single split. So unfortunately, your yearly Kwangdong Freecs collapse is happening right now. Not a great time, but we'll talk about them in a bit. HLE is going to be first player of the series, is going to go to Delight in the support position. A little bit of a spoiler. Of course, Quantum subbing in here for Ondil. I think it is what it is. Like, I think they're pretty similar players in terms of skill level. Quantum looked pretty good when he was playing last split. I don't think he's a star. He has barely any experience at this level, but, Ondil is a player that's hyper inconsistent. His good games are great. His bad games are awful. I understand maybe wanting to move into a more consistent direction if you think you're going to get that out of Quantum, but there was a massive support gap in this series. I mean, the difference between Delight and Quantum was 6,000 years. I mean, truly, the 2 games of Rel were unbelievably good from Delight, and that's what you want to see. Delight, at times in this split, has been a little bit hit or miss. He's had a couple of really bad series for HLE where he's making some poor decisions, but I think generally, as I've said a lot over the course of this year, support is the hardest to play that it has been in a long time right now. This is probably the most difficult support meta in terms of what is being asked of a support, because you do have to kind of do everything. You have to be able to lane, you have to be able to roam early game to help your jungle, and you have to be able to team fight at a high level. All of those skills are necessary. It's not a meta where you can just get away, being good at one thing, being a one trick in terms of like, I'm a good laner, even if I struggle at team fighting. We've seen players like that kind of get weeded out of a lot of the major regions. You kind of have to be a bit more of a jack of all trades. And Delight, I think, struggled a bit at getting back into that mindset, but things have really started to come around. I think they gave him time and he started to play a lot better. A little bit of a spoiler alert. I think generally supports in the LCK are probably the strongest in the world, especially over the course of this week. Some awesome support performances in a meta, again, worse. A lot of supports just aren't playing particularly well. It's really nice to see at least a couple of players really stepping up. Delight definitely a part of that. Want to give a big shout out to the top side of the map as well. Doran continues to have an amazing split. I'm not going to say that he's been as good as he was in summer of last year, because I thought he was excellent in summer of last year, but he has certainly been better than he was in spring, and he has without a doubt been a top 2 top laner in the LCK. Zeus has just not performed up to the level that you would expect him to perform up until this point, in summer at the very least, and Doran has just been better than him. Keen is obviously the best top laner in the LCK right now, but Doran has been kind of close to him, so it's really good to see him, getting back and performing well like he did last year. Peanut is an MVP front runner at the current moment. Whether or not he's going to, be in the conversation because of how Gen.G is doing, I think is up to your personal interpretation, but he's certainly near the top of that conversation for me. Zeka has been super consistent, kind of like a better version of closer, as I've talked about, somebody who can be that third option on a team that doesn't need a lot of resources, but he wins every game. Like, he just does not lose 1v1. He is that good against anybody, by the way. He beats every single mid laner. It's not, player specific. It's not just because he's going into Bulldog. He has beaten the top tier mid laners as well. Viper is the most consistent AD carry in the world. HLE is just the most dangerous team not named Gen.G in the LCK, and I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. For KDF on the other side, this isn't the worst loss. Like, Hanwha Life is a better team than you, that you should be losing this series, but I think it's a symptom of a bigger problem, which is the fact that this team has just lost all momentum and lost all confidence, and that's a really bad place to be in a really pivotal time in the split. You're now sitting at 5 and 6, below 500. FearX just hit 5 and 6 as well. They're fighting for that number 6 spot. If you're not able to hold on to that, that's a problem. Dud of the series is pretty obviously going to go to Quantum, who was awful in this series. Delight completely outplayed him at every single turn. The Nautilus in particular in game 1 was truly horrendous. It's not like the Braum was any better in game number 2, but that champion's just a little bit more useful even if you are kind of running it down. Quantum was just a bit of a problem. Leaper has definitely taken a step back from what he was early on in the split. People were talking about him as if he was this gigantic pickup for KDF after the first week or two. Turns out he's basically the exact same thing as to what Bull was for this team. A 1 or a 2 week wonder that ended up returning back to earth. This bot lane is one of the weaker ones in the LCK in terms of their performances over the last couple of weeks, and that becomes clearer and clearer. Bulldog also really struggled in this matchup. I'm not going to blame him entirely. Zeka is just that good, and Zeka's another player that just doesn't get the same kind of respect that he deserves. Obviously, he's probably one of, if not the #1 channel darling. I know people have argued about that in my comment section, but he's at least in the conversation. I would consider him my best take of all time, and so, you know, Bulldog losing to him is certainly not something that I'm going to hold over him. He's been a player that's been relatively fine. He can be a bit inconsistent, though. Cuz has been fine. Dudu's been a bit of a problem, but he was actually good in this series. I would say Doran was awesome in terms of what he was able to do in the late game. Dudu, I think, was generally fine, didn't make any egregious errors, and that's kind of what you're expecting, but you need your best players to step up more. If Cuz is going to be your best player, you need him to play like it. If Bulldog is going to be somebody that you need to play through, then you need him to play like it, and neither of them were able to do that in this series. For KDF, they just feel like they have a lack of talent, and it feels like they are just coming back down to earth. Their top-end talent is very good, but as we said in spring and as we projected going into the year, they just don't have the consistency throughout the entire lineup. If they don't solve the problems of their weakest players, they're never going to be able to capitalize on their strongest. And then for HLE, like I said, one of the best teams in the world right now. Legitimately, this is a team that can win Worlds. Like, I don't think that that is a crazy thing to say. This is a team that should be in the conversation for being a Worlds, like, favorite. You know, I don't think they are, because Gen.G and, you know, Billy and Top Esports and a lot of these teams end up existing. But if we're talking about HLE as a Worlds winner by the end of the year, I'm really not going to be surprised watching this team now. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2. Again, another predictable outcome, but one that's interesting to talk about nonetheless. Dplus KIA taking on DRX. DK gonna pick up the 2-0 series win here. Again, no surprises. The best teams continue to win. The worst teams continue to lose. If you are a team that is struggling right now, you're probably in a pretty bad position because the top teams are really just that much better than everybody else. I would really consider it a top 4.5. We'll say 4.5 right now, depending on which version of KT Rolster you get on any given day in the LCK. And if you're not a part of that, you're just not going to beat a lot of the other teams that are in that same category. So credit to DK. They continue to look very clinical. DRX continues to really struggle even after their, you know, decent success early on in the split. Player of the series, obvious choice. It's got to go to Showmaker. I mean, the dude was exceptional in this series. On the LeBlanc, on the Azir, it didn't really matter. He just kind of dominated. He was so much better than Yehu on the other side of this matchup. We'll talk about him in a second, that it just became clear that he should be in the MVP conversation. This is really the only place that you can sit after this kind of performance, not just based off of this one series, obviously, but based off what he's done so far this split. DK has been more competitive than I and a lot of other people were anticipating. They've certainly been better than what they were in the spring split, and Showmaker is by far the best player on this team. He is the one who is driving them forward, and certainly the player that I think has had the biggest impact. Now, Lucid taking that next big leap has certainly helped a lot. He has been so much more consistent than he ever was in the spring split. He has gotten so much better over the course of summer, which I think has helped out this team a ton, but it really is Showmaker winning so consistently 1v1 in the mid lane that creates these opportunities. Really, the only time that Showmaker has looked outclassed is against Chovy when he was down a lot of CS and, you know, getting Flame Horizoned, and you just have to live with that. It's Chovy who's able to kind of dominate everybody, but Showmaker's awesome, and he deserves the credit for it. Like I said, Lucid also continues to look good. A pretty easy jungle mid matchup. DRX's jungle mid is a disaster. Sponge and Yehu have just not been able to play in the last couple of weeks at an LCK caliber level. You know, we talk about teams like Bro that really struggle with bot lane, KDF that really struggle with bot lane. DRX's problem is mid jungle. They just are not able to generate any sort of pressure through the middle of the map, and I would argue that's way worse than having a bot lane problem because mid jungle is just way more important in the current meta. Lucid and Showmaker definitely exploited that here. Aiming and Kellen continue to look great. Kellen is way better than he gets credit for, specifically on things like Alistair. I do think he can improve a bit on his enchanters. That's always been kind of the scouting report on Kellen, but the Renata was still generally fine, and aiming was really good on the Ashe, on the Ezreal. You know, he goes deathless in this series. I think he's a bit of a KDA monster, at least in his current iteration. You know, aiming's the kind of player that, you know, pretty routinely receives praise from fans in terms of his gameplay, not in terms of his off the rift, you know, cheering for performance, but he's always somebody that I've gotten comments about being underrated. I think he is a good player. I don't think he's an elite player. I think he's like an upgraded version of Teddy who happens to be on a good team. So, you know, you live with that if you're DK. You can win a lot with aiming. You can win the LCK with aiming as your AD carry. Kingan's also fine. I don't think he's a star up on the top side. I've never really thought ridiculously highly of Kingan outside of that 1 year on DRX in which he was awesome. Outside of that, he's really just kind of been an okay player his whole career, and that has stayed here for DK. But Showmaker and Lucid are a dynamic duo in terms of the mid jungle right now, and Showmaker in particular, MVP frontrunner. And then for DRX, so many issues. We've already talked about it. Jungle mid is just such a massive problem for them. The middle of the map map is such a disaster. Yehu is once again going to get dud of the series. He got dud of the week for the entire week last week in week number 5. I think I just said week in that one sentence like 4 or 5 times. That's kind of funny. But he is just completely collapsed. He was a player that looked like he could stabilize for DRX in the mid lane throughout a majority of the end of spring and the beginning here of summer. It really felt like he was going to be someone that they could actually kind of invest in the mid lane spot, and perhaps if the team got better, he could do something in the mid lane role. He has lost all his confidence. The last like 3 series have been some of the worst mid lane League of Legends that we've seen in the LCK all year, and that's a pretty low bar to end up hitting considering just how bad players like Karis have been pretty consistently. So Yehu is certainly a player that I'm losing confidence in game over game. Sponge is a player that just needs to go back down to the Challengers League. He was called up too early. Clearly, he is not ready, and the confidence is shot. Frog was back in. I think it's the right choice. I've said that multiple times over the last couple of weeks. Frog, at the very least, is able to team fight. Rascal is bad in every phase of the game. I get that Frog might even be worse mechanically, but at least he's able to try and play front-to-back 5v5s, and, you know, people will say that Teddy is elo held, made some major mistakes in game number 1 on the Ashe. I think he's just, again, kind of getting back into the Teddy mold, not being active enough to really get his team advantages. It's a little bit more excusable in this meta, but, you know, this is a problem that's persisted for Teddy throughout his entire career, is that he is just not the kind of player you want as your best player. He needs to be the second or the third option on a team to really get the most out of him. Kind of similar to Aiming, except I think Aiming is just a better player. Playta, a player that I really believe in, clearly has mentally checked out for this team. A lot of the great plays and aggressive flanks that he was making at the beginning of this split that really led to me, you know, not only jumping on the bandwagon, I'd already been on the bandwagon, but like really saying, all right, I'm being proven right. A lot of those are gone just because I think a lot of this team has given up. So I don't think the DRX is going to do anything. I think they might get worse week over week, which is kind of the anticipation. But DK fighting for one of those upper spots. They're going to get a chance to prove that they deserve to be in that conversation later in the week, and we'll see how that ends up going for them. But then moving on to day number 3 now, our middle day here in week 6, and it's another pretty predictable outcome, a lot of them over the course of this week. FearX taking on OK BRION. FearX is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Bro is just expected to lose 2-0 in every single series that they play. Maybe DRX is a team that they could potentially beat down the stretch, but genuinely outside of that, like, I don't think there's anybody in the LCK that should be projected to lose even a game to OK BRION. They really are just that dysfunctional and that, you know, lacking in talent at the current moment, and FearX, to their credit, is kind of peaking at the exact right moment, especially for them. You know, they're getting better as the split goes on, but I think the roster change has really ignited something in this team. I think taking Execute out and more specifically putting Duro in has been a massive plus for Fox, because player of the series for me is going to go to Duro in the support position. He is awesome. This guy's actually really good. I'm not going to say that they found lightning in a bottle here, but Henna's the kind of, you know, AD carry that has really never been all that consistent over the course of his career. He's had good moments, he's had bad moments, but he's not someone I would have ever hung my hat on and said, like, he could be an actively positive piece for a playoff team. It felt like if he was ever going to be a top 6 type of player in terms of, you know, his team performance, he was going to have to be the third or so option. Henna has actually been able to be a primary carry for this team, at least in terms of resources, because Duro is so good in terms of generating those resources. So I feel very good about him right now. He's going to get player of the series, as I said. He's just really kind of pseudo broken out here for Fox. He is the exact kind of mid-season roster addition that can actually tip your team over the edge. He's a really interesting support player, so hopefully he can continue that positive growth. But Closer continues to be awesome. Honestly, this might be his best series of the year. He was really good in this one. Fate is a genuinely good player. He's somebody that I don't think is like a star, but he's around the same level as Closer, maybe a bit more consistent, but with a little bit less of like the high highs. But Closer was just awesome in lane. Like the 1v1s here were excellent. He's still pulling out things like LeBlanc that we're just not seeing a lot elsewhere in the world, and it's really working for him. I thought he was great here, and honestly, he's been great in summer. I'm going to make the statement that this is right now probably the best split of his entire career. People will definitely argue, oh, 2022 summer, but go watch the videos I made in 2022 summer. I thought he was incredibly overrated, and quite frankly, that team was hard carried by Prince and Kale and Croco, and, you know, they were the driving forces of that sandbox team. It really was not Closer, who ended up getting all-pro because it's a team-based award and not a player-based award, as I've talked talked about as a criticism for the LCK in the past, but I honestly think from an individual performance perspective, this might be his most impressive split ever. Clear and Raptor also continue to look good. I really have no qualms about them. Talked about them highly earlier. A lot of the pressure and the positive notes went to the bottom side of the map, which is good because we already saw the top side play well. So I feel very good about FearX. They're sitting at 500 going into the second half here, or I guess just starting off the second half. That's a pretty good place for them to be. I know the game score isn't the best at 12 and 15, but it's certainly good enough, and especially with KDF struggling, they're in a decent position. And for Bro on the other side, you know, there's just not a lot to talk about when it comes to them. They are exactly who we thought they were. I still think Fate is an interesting addition, and I think it's the right thing to do to go out and at least try to get someone that could potentially win you a game or two down the stretch, because, I mean, there's no point in tanking in the LCK, but there's just not enough talent, and this bot lane really sucks. Envy is going to get dud of the series once again. He's just not a good player. Like, there is just nothing else left for me to say. He has essentially underperformed at every single stop. The only time he's ever looked even remotely good as an AD carry player is for one split on Sandbox before he ended up getting replaced, and in that split, he was essentially playing with the core of players that has proven to be able to elevate basically any AD carry that they've played with. Kroko, Kale, you know, we see Closer now playing well on the other side of this. You know, it wasn't Envy has proven that he's not the guy, that it's not the kind of player that you should be investing a ton of resources into. I'm sorry, he's just not good. Morgan continues to really struggle on the top side. Clear is just better than him. Young-Jae was fine. I actually thought he was pretty good in this series in terms of his pathing, just couldn't really do anything. Polu also wasn't a problem, but he also wasn't a solution. He was overcorrecting instead of just trying to fix his communication problems. He ended up just being a lot more passive in this series, and I think that that's going to be a bit more of a negative for Bro. So I don't really feel good about this team. They're the worst in the LCK. They're one of the worst in any major region in the world. Again, I think you could put them up against Rogue and Shopify and basically anybody RNG, you know, and they would certainly be an interesting candidate to be the worst major region team, but they just, I don't really see them going anywhere, even if I do like the addition of Fate. And then for Fox, you know, they are good. Hopefully this team can continue their good form if they can continue to stay above KDF in particular. I think a playoff berth would actually be a really big positive for this org. I don't think they were anticipating it, but if they get it, they've certainly earned it with some of the decisions they've made. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it is our second telecom war of the split, T1 taking on KT Rolster. But this time, T1 is going to be able to get the job done, pick up the victory, and get back above 500. This team has been in free-fall mode over the past couple of weeks. The last 3-4 series that they've ended up playing have kind of been disastrous for them. This looked like a team that was basically going to cruise to second place in the regular season. They lost to Gen.G early on in the year, but it didn't feel like they were too affected by that. It felt like they were going to be able to take down teams like Hanwha Life, be able to take down teams like Dplus KIA, but that's not necessarily been the case. They've really struggled. You know, HLE in particular seems to kind of have their number at the current moment, and you were really concerned because KT beat them earlier on in the year, and I generally think there are realistic reasons to believe that T1 is getting worse over the course of the year, but they are able to stabilize, they're able to win this game number 3, and they're able to take this series, which is massive for them. And it's off the back of a super aggressive draft in game number 3 that ends up working out. This is kind of a feast or famine draft. It either looks really good and works really well, or it doesn't work in the way that you would want it to, and you end up getting outscaled at 15 minutes, and the game is just over because Zeri is unstoppable. There is a real concern of that, but lucky for T1, they were able to win early, transition that into good fights in the mid to late game, and smart decision making ends up closing it out for them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Gumayushi. This Caitlyn Lux, like, that is the story of this series for me. It's certainly the story of game number 3. Caitlyn Lux was incredibly strong for T1, completely shut down Deft and Barrel's ability to play the game. I think Caitlyn is in a really interesting spot because I think so many people are going for these self-sustaining bot lanes. Caitlyn is self-sustaining. She doesn't need a lot of resources. You don't need to give her jungle attention in order for her to be strong. You would like to give her some priority. You would like to make sure that she's in a position where she can push up and try to take an early tower and then move her around the map as you want, but Zeri is not the kind of bot laner that can go toe-to-toe with something like Caitlyn, so I do like the idea of potentially trying to force the issue, essentially, in the bot lane in terms of draft, and they certainly executed on it well. Whether you want to give player of the game in game 3 to Guma or Keria, I think both of them ended up earning it. I think Guma definitely did more interesting things. He's one of the best Caitlyns in the world. The guy's mechanics are just ridiculous. It's funny because he's probably going into the other best Caitlyn in the world in Deft right now in this series, so interesting to see, but Deft could not even remotely play the game in game number 3. He was perma-CC'd, and the damage was just ridiculous. The range is ridiculous. It's a very scary lane if you don't have an answer for it, and KT did not, so credit to Guma and Keria, even if Keria was a bit in game number 2. That's kind of the reason he's not getting player of the series is the Sejuani game, but generally I'm not going to criticize him too heavily. I also want to give a bunch of props to the top side of the map. Both Zeus and Owner, I think, played really well here. Zeus definitely got back on track. The Cassante, the Kennen looked pretty good in this series. Perfect is not like the worst opponent in the entire world. I like Perfect quite a bit. As a top laner, I think his tape has looked really good so far at the LCK level, and Zeus definitely showed more of the Zeus that we know and love in this series. He was able to win early, and that's kind of the determining factor as to whether or not he is going to play well. Owner's pathing is unbelievably good. That Poppy game in game number 1 is going to go super under the radar, but he was amazing. That champion just does so much, and I'm always shocked by how little teams invest into it, how many teams just don't want to pick Poppy and don't want to invest, play that champion. It's very strange to me because she does so many things, and she can be so flexible that I think she would be one of the highest priority champions for me, but Owner looking good on it. Still good on Lee Sin in Italy. We know he's good on those types of champions, but it's nice to see him continue to get better at these facilitators. Faker somehow, some way was the only player with a bounty in game number 3. Don't really understand how that happened, but he was fine. Did let his team down a bit in game number 2 on the Taliyah where he wasn't particularly good, but somehow, some way, Faker was probably the least valuable player on T1 just because everybody else was super good this series. I don't really have a lot of negatives to give them. I think outside of game 2, they were essentially perfect, and that's what you want to see. And then for KT, some ups and downs. I think BDD had a pretty good series, all things considered. The Lucian obviously was dominant in game number 2, and with how BDD has been playing recently, I think you'll take that. I think you'll take the fact that there were some ups and downs because it's mostly kind of not been good for BDD, so you'll live with that. I think Perfect also showed some really interesting things in terms of his ability to play out late games, even when he isn't doing particularly well in the laning phase. I don't think Perfect's a bad player at all. I think he's the kind of player that can grow into being one of the best top laners in the LCK. Pyosik generally wasn't the problem. Bot lane just kind of got gapped in game number 3. I'm giving dud of the series to Beryl. I definitely considered giving it to Deft just because he couldn't play game 3, but it really wasn't his fault, and Beryl could have played better, and he also lost just as hard. And so, oftentimes I'll just try to point out the player that was the least effective. At times that was Deft, but really Beryl was the player who probably deserved it here. Either way, bot lane was definitely a gap in the third and final game here, and that just can't be the case. Beryl historically performs incredibly well against T1, notably well against T1, if you will, so definitely a bit surprising to see him really underperform when this is typically a game he really locks in and gets himself up for, but he wasn't particularly good in terms of the engages this series, just wasn't very active, was probably the least active player on the entirety of KT Rolster. I think that's kind of been a side effect of what I've talked about with the meta getting more difficult. I think a lot of these players who were super aggressive, who have been getting punished for a lot of this year, are actually just starting to get a little bit scared and are starting to play more passive. That's kind of been the development, and that's what's really separating the best supports from the bad supports right now, and I'm not saying Beryl's bad, I'm just saying that, it's certainly interesting that he has taken a less gung-ho approach in terms of engages than maybe he would have last year, but this bot lane has to be better. Deft has been kind of hit or miss for this KT Rolster team. I still think he's been the best player, but, he'll have bad games every once in a while, and you just have to live with that. KT drops below 500 once again. They have been climbing up the standings and trying to get themselves into a good position. Theoretically, they're not locked in for the playoffs or anything like that. 5 and 6 is the same record as KDF, who we say is kind of doomed right now, is in a free fall, a spiral. So, say what you will about KT, but, they're certainly not guaranteed anything at this point. And for T1, they're not guaranteed anything either. They're at 6 and 5. Like, that's an okay place to be, but it's certainly not the best place in the world. We'll need to see how they finish out the week. I'd love to see them at 7 and 5. That would make me feel a lot better, but this team still has a long ways to go before I feel great about them guaranteeing being a top 2. And then moving on now to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off with what is likely the series of the week, one of the most fun series we've had in a long time. Hanwha Life Esports taking on Dplus KIA. A lot on the line here in terms of reputation and expectation, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They are proving that I was correct last week for having Hanwha Life jump DK for that number 2 spot. I just felt like they were better on paper, that they were a little bit more consistent, and I think that they have higher upside, and that was proven to be correct here. But I will say this series was damn close from both of these teams. Both of them really showing up and showing out, putting on their best performances, and both coming away, I think, looking really solid. I think that there are positives and negatives for both teams. I'm going to start with the losing team. That's kind of rare for me to do, but I just have to talk about this first because it really is the storyline of this series in my eyes. Aiming going 28-1 over the last 2 games on Kai'Sa and losing the series is genuinely insane. Like, that is 14-0 in game number 2, 14-1, 1 death in their game 3 45-minute loss, and losing the series genuinely feels so bad. This is the best series Aiming has played in a very, very long time, and quite frankly, I very narrowly gave him player of the series. I genuinely think he might have been the best player on the Rift, and it really is kind of a tragedy, a travesty, if you will, that DK ended up losing this, and I don't think that's because they are, like, awful and that they completely threw it. I think HLE played great. I think a lot of their players ended up banding together just better. I think they knew how to play around their carry in the Tristana a little bit more efficiently than maybe DK did around Aiming, but you gotta give Aiming the credit he deserves. 28-1 over 2 games and losing the series is genuinely absurd, and I do think there were other good performances. I think, generally speaking, Kingan was really good in the team fights of this series. I think Kellen was really good in the team fights of this series, but unfortunately, we have to talk about the fact that Showmaker kind of let this team down, and this is definitely going to be a conversation of whether or not Showmaker can get it done at the highest level. I know that that has been a bit of a conversation over the last few splits just because of the way that he has finished a lot of them, the performances that he's given, but this was definitely a concern. The Game 3 Jace was just not good enough. The fact that he was the worst player in game number 3 is really not acceptable. Like, I understand Zeka's really good, and we will get to him, and losing to Zeka is certainly nothing to feel bad about, even if I do think these two are incredibly comparable in terms of skill, but being useless in the late game is something that I can be a little bit frustrated by when it comes to Showmaker. This is somebody who we just talked about was an MVP guy. He's somebody who's in the MVP conversation for sure. You just can't get away with performances like this if that's who you're going to be. I think the rest of this team was fine, but Lucid, I do think, was a bit out-jungled by Peanut in terms of the facilitator role in this series. Overall, though, it's just hard to be mad at DK. Aiming was so fed. You should have won this series, but HLE was just a little bit better, and that's a credit to HLE, who is playing at a top-tier level right now. I really mean it when I say this team can win Worlds, not just get to Worlds and, you know, not just get to, like, oh, top 8 or top 4, whatever, right? Like, this team could absolutely win the World Championships. They have everything that they need in order to do that. They just need to keep rolling, and it feels like they're getting better and better. That's the scary part when it comes to HLE. Zeka's gonna get player of the series for me. He just narrowly gets it over Aiming, who obviously was the other candidate here, but the Tristana was just too valuable in game number 3. HLE had a win condition, and they played around it better, and Zeka was that win condition. I continue to think that he gets undervalued by the community. This guy is just as good as Showmaker, and I think he proved at times in this series that he is just better than Showmaker, and, you know, he's a top 3 mid laner in the LCK, a top 5 mid laner in the world, and it's not even up for debate anymore. This guy has consistently been in that conversation, so I firmly believe in Zeka. I still think that Peanut does not get the credit he deserves. Another fantastic series from him in terms of being able to understand what his team's win condition is and play towards that. Peanut has been amazing across this split. Doran, Viper, and Delight were all fine. Not necessarily stars, but they were certainly good. Delight had a better series, I would say, than maybe the other two, but HLE picking up the win, that's what matters. Sitting at 11-2, that's the important part of coming out of this week. They're in a really, really decent spot, and I'm really excited to see what they end up doing, but for DK, you know, unfortunately, just barely wasn't enough. You had the win condition, and you couldn't quite enable it in the way that you needed to. I still think this team is good, but I think top 2 hype might just be a little bit out of their reach right now. And then moving to our second series of day number 4, and again, another predictable outcome. I know that there's been a lot of these. I appreciate you guys watching the video. It's the Kwangdong Freecs taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to move to 12-0. We will get into the implications of what that means in just a second, because that means quite a bit for Gen.G moving forward, but just in context, however you want to say it, this is dominance. This is 24-1 in 25 games in the LCK. This is not some schmuck region. A lot of people consider this by far the best region in the world at the current moment, and Gen.G is 24-1. In 25 games, they have lost 1. Like, there is just nothing else left to say. There is nothing else left to even talk about when it comes to this team. They are perfect at the current moment in almost every possible way. The carry duo here just completely put them over the edge. It's not even their MVP frontrunner that has ended up being the one that's carried them through this week. Canyon was good, but he was on Sejuani and Maokai duty for basically the whole week. It was Chovy, and more specifically, it was my player of the series, Pays, in the bot lane, who is once again showing that summer is his split. When he's able to get comfortable, when the rest of the team is willing to play for him, when he can play, you know, things that are a little bit more self-sustaining and play for late games, all of a sudden games become a lot easier for him to win. This is another really great example of this idea that Jin being a weak champion is like specifically an LEC brain rot thing. Jin is awesome. Like, this champion is so oppressive to end up playing into, and I will continue to die on the hill of Jin is one of those picks that if you play it correctly and if you can play around it with the rest of your team, it's probably the most oppressive thing in the entire game to play into. There's really just no way to beat a strong Jin that has help, that has assistance, and we saw that here in game number 2. Now, getting there is not nearly as consistent as it is for things like Ezreal and Ashe, and there's a reason that Jin might not be prioritized as highly as those other champions, but this idea that Jin is bad in any way, shape, or form, I'm going to continue to very loudly try to dispel, because this is one of the best AD carries in the game at the moment, and it's proven basically every single time he's played in a major region. But we do have to give some credit to the player as well. Paze is just absolutely on fire. This guy, when he, like I said, is given the resources, when he's allowed to play for late game, he's one of the best AD carries in the world, a very apt successor to Ruler, I think. They're good at different things. He's not quite the mid-game monster that Ruler is, and I certainly think that, you know, his early games are definitely a little bit lacking in terms of comparing him to what is probably the greatest AD carry of all time. However, I do think that his late games are spectacular, and maybe even better than Ruler's at this point in time, so you feel really good about him. I almost gave player of the series to Chovy. The guy pulled out Draven mid game number 1, Zeri mid game number 2, and he still was absolutely dominant in the laning phase. It's just impressive stuff. Like, Chovy is unbelievably good. I feel really good about Bulldog, because Bulldog actually, you know, went up 1v1 against him and tried his best to stay even and really keep the matchup interesting, but Chovy is just better, and you watch the late game team fighting of him, he is perfection. Like, he is the best player in the world, and it's not close. Like we said, Canyon, probably the MVP frontrunner right now, probably everyone's pick for MVP, and yet he played Sejuani and Maokai all week and was still super useful, just maybe not quite as attention-grabbing as he has been recently. Lahen's had a great week. Keen only had 1 death across this entire series. Gen.G is just unbelievable. 12-0, 22 or 24-1. It's ridiculous. And the Kwangdong Freecs, I do feel bad for them because this was never going to be a series that they ended up winning. I think they kind of resigned themselves to that fact. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is as much a part of the losing streak as a lot of the other series that they've ended up, you know, having over the past couple of weeks, but it certainly doesn't help things. It does push this team below 500 in terms of game score, which is kind of the last thing they were holding on to. They're sitting at 5-7 now. Really not an ideal place to be, and honestly, dud of the series could go quite a few ways. They were just completely outclassed in this series, but I'm going to give it to Leaper. Leaper's kind of regression back to the mean has certainly been noticeable. He is having the exact same arc as what Bull had last split, which is really sad because Bull was the kind of player that they were like, he's not going to get us over the top. Maybe we can bring in this streamer that, you know, has ridiculous mechanics and see if we can translate that to pro play. At the beginning, it seemed to work, but, you know, as teams have figured out this bot lane and how they wanted to play, Leaper has been significantly less successful in the early game, and that's definitely not ideal. Quantum also was awful across this entire week, like unplayably bad in both of their series. We'll see if they want to stick with him or they could potentially go back to Ondil. This was a tough series in terms of opponents, a very hard week for KDF, but I do want to give some positives. Bulldog was good here. He was definitely the best player on KDF, was actually going toe-to-toe with Chovy for a majority of these laning phases, just couldn't actually do anything once the rest of his team completely collapsed and caved in. You're going to have to live with that, but Cuz outplayed by Canyon, Dudu completely outplayed by Keen. You know, there's just not a lot to celebrate when it comes to the performance of KDF, but there is a lot to celebrate for Gen.G because not only are they 12-0, not only are they 24-1, but they've officially qualified for the playoffs, and you know what that means because they won MSI. They have now officially qualified for Worlds. I know we just talked about G2 in yesterday's video. Technically, Gen.G is the first team to qualify for the 2024 World Championships because this did happen before the finals. I know I'm covering it after on the channel, but congratulations to Gen.G. This was never in doubt. All they had to do was make playoffs, and they're 12-0. I mean, they've qualified in week number 6. Like, it's genuinely ridiculous what they're doing right now, but Gen.G is going to be going to Worlds, and they're going to be the favorite to win the tournament. Basically, regardless of what happens, I think even if they end up losing in the playoffs, I think a lot of people, me included, are going to have them as favorites to go and win that World Championship just based off of the talent on this team, and they have earned it. This has been the most dominant team that I have seen, and I know I say that a lot. Like, I said that about JD Gaming last year, but they're 12-0. They're 24-1 in the LCK. This is one of the most dominant teams of all time, and we'll see if they can end up capping off the story. At least for now, though, it's going really well. But then moving on now to day number 5, our final day here in the LCK in week 6, and we kick it off with a predictable, once again, matchup between T1 and DRX, which T1 is going to pick up a 2-0 series win in. We've been talking about it. T1 just getting some confidence back is super important. I get that these aren't exactly the hardest series in the world. KT was a good win earlier on in the week, but DRX, this is a predictable win. This was basically a free W on the schedule, but that's what T1 needs right now. They need to know they can come out and play strong and actually be able to control the game. They need that confidence back. They need to be able to understand the way that they want to play their early games out a little bit more clearly. And I think series like this definitely help with something like that. Hopefully this is something they can start to springboard into more consistent success, but at least for now, it's actually looking pretty okay this week. And a lot of that is off the back of Gumayusi playing awesome here in week 6. He's going to get yet another player of the series. He's been pretty hit or miss for T1 over the course of this split. There's been a couple of good series, a couple of bad series. In their losses, he's not exactly the most consistent player in the world, but when they allow him to actually go out and be the primary focal point for the resources of this team, he does a really good job paying that back. And then some. The Senna, obviously something that we've become very accustomed to for T1 over the course of this year, but the Draven was better. You know, he was awesome in game number 2. I still think he was good in game 1 on the Senna. Definitely somebody that was doing a good job of capitalizing on the things that Owner was creating on the Vi, but he's getting this player of the series for the Draven game in game 2 when he really was given the keys to the kingdom. He went up against that Kalista Renata lane and just kind of bodied it. It was really good stuff from Guma. I think KT also played well. He's also been having kind of a rough stretch, but I also think this was a pretty important week for him overall in terms of getting that confidence back. Owner has honestly been pretty good over the course of this split. I'm not going to try and sit here and say that I'm more impressed with Owner than I have been in quite a few splits, but I'm pretty impressed with how Owner has been able to play regarding the fact that some of his lanes aren't exactly performing super consistently with Zeus and Guma and Keria, not exactly being the best 1v1 or 2v2 lanes at the current moment. For Owner to consistently be able to get early game leads, that was something I criticized of him, is that he was good because of the structure of T1 and not exactly because of the plays that he individually was making. Not that he couldn't make those plays, just that he wasn't asked to make those plays a lot for T1, but he has actually been asked to do a lot more of that so far this split, and he's kind of stepped up to the plate, so that's a really good sign. Zeus was definitely back here. He definitely still is making some mistakes in lane. Frog was one of those players that was still very active on the map, and we'll talk about him, but, Zeus, I think, was better in week 6 than he was in week 5, and that's a good performance. And then, Faker still not necessarily clicking on every single level, but certainly good enough to be able to win this series. But Guma, very good week. I thought Owner had a really good week. Keria had a really good week. Zeus had a really good week. There's just a lot of positives to take away for T1, and not so many for DRX. I mean, this team sucks. Like, there's just nothing else left to say. When the bot lane's not competitive, this team cannot win games. That is just kind of the end of the story. There is nothing else left to say on that front. Dud of the series is going to go to Sponge in the jungle. We've been talking about how the middle of the map has essentially been a black hole for DRX. Now, Yehu was significantly better in this series, but better, quote-unquote, in like a less effective way, where he's playing Aurelion Sol and he is able to get resources, but it just takes him way too long to ramp up into the part of the game where he is going to be relevant. It was a lot more relevant in game number 1 and game number 2. Things didn't exactly go his way either, so Sponge struggling in both games is definitely something to keep note of, but the middle of the map just simply has to be better than what it has been. It's going to continue to cause DRX to lose basically every series if they can't stabilize there. I think Teddy and Playta also just kind of lost. The Kalista Renata, the Kalista Nico, not quite as good in this series. When you're going into something like Draven, you have to be able to stabilize early, and you can't give him the lead that he so desperately wants. Unfortunately, Teddy was just quite not good enough in order to survive the onslaught that Guma and Keria ended up putting on him. Frog was pretty decent on the top side, really had no negative things to say about him. I actually thought he played the late game really well. He almost solo killed Gumayusi in one of these fights, which was really funny, but, I still think Frog has significantly more interesting plays than Rascal does when you look over the course of this year, so hopefully they continue to stick with him for the rest of this split, but DRX isn't going to do anything. It's not like whether or not they change out their roster or something, they're immediately going to become a playoff team or anything like that. This is one of the weaker teams in the league, and they keep proving that, and T1 hopefully is starting to get their, mental back in terms of, the Esports World Cup definitely drained them in terms of their, momentum, and not the confidence because they won the tournament, but, they came back very tired, they came back very overworked, and I think they're starting to get back into the groove of the regular season, which is all that T1 really needs to do. And then moving on to our final series of the week here, and it's a battle of red teams that again goes as anticipated. Nongshim RedForce taking on KT Rolster, with KT picking up the 2-1 series win. Now they do drop a game that's a little bit more interesting than maybe some of the other series that we've gotten so far, but again, not a shocking outcome. This is what we expected from these two teams. KT does step up to the plate and perform well here, which I think is a good sign, but Nongshim, you know, tries some interesting things. Calyx was back in the mid lane for this one. It seems like they're just going to be switching around between him and Fisher until they find something that they like. I think Calyx has more upside. He certainly has some more interesting games. Fisher has just never really looked particularly good, even in his lower level of competition. However, we've seen Nongshim mid lane projects in the past not necessarily work out when brought up. I've mentioned players like Call Me and Fiesta in the past who both looked excellent in the Challengers League and just couldn't quite translate it to the LCK. Hopefully Calyx is the one who ends up breaking the trend, but KT looked awesome in this series, and it's their mid laner that I really want to highlight. BDD is going to get player of the series, and he had his best week of the split up until this point. He has honestly really concerned me over the course of this year. I'm not sure it's been talked about enough just how much he has struggled individually as a player. He has really not had a very good split. The encouraging parts are there. He got better down the stretch of spring. Towards the end of the regular season, he was playing some of his best League of Legends that he had played all year, but he came back out here in summer and immediately started to underperform again. And so I was like, okay, well, hopefully we can get the same trend. At least that does seem to be getting replicated a little bit. BDD performing a lot better here in the second half so far than he did the first half. Like I said, week 6 probably his best week up until this point, but you're still expecting a lot more individually out of him as a player if this team wants to go as far as they want to go. They want to be a Worlds team. BDD getting back on track is going to be a big part of that, so it's nice to see him play so well in this series. I do want to give a big shout out to Deft and Beryl as well, who I thought were very consistent. Beryl in particular, some awesome engages. This was infinitely better than his series against T1 earlier in the week, and it's kind of the opposite of what you would expect for Beryl. Beryl typically overperforms against good teams and underperforms against bad teams. He's always just had kind of a mental lock-in kind of problem in the regular season where it's clear that he just doesn't, you know, try his hardest in every single series that he ends up playing, but when he is out there trying to win, when he is, like, motivated, he's awesome. He's Beryl. Like, we know what he can do. Two-time world champion. He was great in this series. Deft was pretty good. The Ezreal definitely looks better than other things. I've seen some people complain that Ezreal was let through instead of the Talia. I think it's Reddit brain rot to think that Talia is some sort of weak champion in a meta where everybody can dash and that she actually does a ton of damage. I genuinely think you would have to not play the game to understand, like, not understand why Talia is really good in the meta right now. That's just my personal opinion. Sorry if that comes off relatively harsh, but yeah, I would have let Ezreal through over Talia. Deft was just really good. Jiwoo went for the Caitlyn matchup and it didn't end up working out in the early game. Piochik was solid. You know, Perfect was along for the ride. You know, it was generally good from KT. Again, I wish I didn't see a loss in game 2. I wish they didn't end up dropping that middle game. That would have certainly made me feel a bit better about it, but overall, 500's not the worst place to be considering how up and down a lot of other teams have been over the course of this split so far. But for Nongshim, you know, they're still probably in the exact same spot. They're probably the best of the rest. They are probably better than both Bro and DRX, who are both just utter disasters at the moment, but I don't think they're ever going to be able to achieve much higher than that. It really does feel like the top 7 are all competing for those 6 playoff spots, and Nongshim very comfortably comes in at number 8. They're just not good enough to be able to compete in that upper echelon. Guger is going to get my dud of the series. Really did feel like Beryl was completely outplaying him. Now, Guger actually had a pretty good week last week. He was doing some really interesting things in some of the series. There has been some upside individually to him in terms of games. I just don't know if the consistency has been there, but that's also a problem with the team not necessarily being able to support him. Jiwoo also was, like, uncharacteristically awful in their losses. He was awesome on the Ezreal in Game 2, was awful on the Zeri and the Caitlyn, and so I very much considered him for dud of the series, but, you know, he just had too good of a game number 2 in order for me to give that to him. Guger was definitely the player that I think was a little bit easier to justify. Mihail, Sylvie, they just continue to be basically nothing burgers on the top of the map. Calyx does look interesting. Hopefully he can continue to develop. Again, he's another player that everybody is super excited about coming out of the Nongshim system. I hope he just doesn't fall into the same traps that every other mid laner coming through that has been really interesting has fallen into. Hopefully he can, you know, figure things out on a team that just clearly doesn't have a lot of other options. But Nongshim is what they are. I'm happy they won a game, but it doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, and KT is going to be happy with their series win. The problem for KT is not beating teams like Nongshim. It's being consistent at all. It's even remotely trying to sneak into the top 4. Honestly, they feel at least a full half step down from the top 4 right now, and that's really not where they want to be. Somehow, some way, they're starting to lock themselves in, but they need to be better than 500 if they want to compete for a world spot. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen now, the updated standings after 6 weeks of action. We can see a lot of things on the screen. Of course, Gen.G highlighted in green and also with an asterisk. They have qualified for the playoffs, which means because they won MSI, they have qualified for Worlds. The restriction is that the MSI winner automatically qualifies for Worlds so long as they make their region's playoffs in the summer split. Gen.G having done that already, sitting at 12-0. You're not supposed to qualify for the playoffs in week 6, but Gen.G's a little ahead of schedule. I think that's become clear, so that's why they're highlighted in green and also given the asterisk. But every other team just jockeying for position. You can see a power rank column next to every single team. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Changes how they have changed from last week to this week, or how they would have changed, because once again, as has become pretty customary in this year so far, just in a lot of different regions, there's not any changes to my power rankings. I don't know whether to take that as I have a really good eye for the meta and I'm doing a great job at analyzing whether or not teams are good, or alternatively, if there just have not been a lot of upsets and, you know, things are going pretty predictably. I'll leave that up to you to kind of decide down in the comments section, but this has happened multiple times in the LCK. It's happened in the LCS. Hell, there have been weeks that I've been considering not making any changes to the LPL, and they play like 500 games a week, and so, you know, it's really just kind of a weird year in general, but yeah, no changes. I think everything is the exact same. The only one I considered was moving KDF down to number 7 and Fox to up to number 6. I think that that is certainly on the brain, and I want to see what exactly happens to these two teams going forward. Like, yes, Fox has outperformed KDF in the recent weeks. KDF has dropped series to teams that they have no business losing to, like Bro being Bro's only win, but Fox is not exactly beating the cream of the crop. They're not exactly going out there and beating top 5 teams or staying competitive, and you know, once their schedule gets harder, which it's about to get harder, I'm not exactly sure Fox is going to end out the season all that well. We could be looking at a 6 or a 7 win team at the end of the split just based off how their schedule ended up working out. And KDF could be a lot higher than that if they get their act together. And so for now, I'm going to leave things the same. Obviously, they play in a couple of weeks. That's going to be a very telling matchup in terms of who might get that 6th and final playoff spot. But at least for now, I feel pretty good about keeping things the way that they are. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments section below. But it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6. And player of the week is going to go to Pays. It's the second time this year, or this split, I should say, that he's gotten player of the week. He got it in week 1. He's getting it again here in week number 6. He's just been awesome over the course of this split. It's been a little bit scattered. I think Gen.G every single week picks one player that they just really want to focus on, whether it's been Canyon or Chovy or now Pays. You know, Keen's kind of been thrown in that conversation. Lahenz has been really good this split. Obviously, you're not 12-0 on accident, and so everybody's playing well, but it's funny how every single week it feels like both series are kind of centered around one player, and Pays was that player this week. He has really locked in, and I think he's expanded his game quite a bit. Still a great team fighter, but much better in the mid game. My honorable mentions, Gumayushi, the AD carry for T1. This felt like an obvious one. I think in most weeks, Guma would have won player of the week with how he performed. Unfortunately, Pays was just a little bit better than him, in my opinion, this week. And then Duro, the support for FearX. Really excited to talk about him. He's been a pretty massive upgrade to Fox over the course of this split so far. Hopefully he can hang on to that. He's, again, had some pretty easy opponents to go into since he's been subbed in for Execute. We'll see if this ends up lasting or if Duro's going to struggle a bit more when he starts going up against better supports and better teams in general, but at least for now, it's been nothing but an unequivocal upgrade for FearX to have brought him in. He has been excellent for this team. So those are my 2 honorable mentions. Pays is my player of the week, and my dud of the week is going to go to Envy. Now, this was a 2-horse race. Either Envy or Quantum had to go to one of those two. They were both genuinely miserable this week, and quite frankly, if I could give 2 duds of the week, I absolutely would, but Envy was just slightly worse for me. Bro's bot lane being such a problem and being such a liability is just so noticeable because they do have some decent performers elsewhere. Morgan obviously is letting this team down a little bit, but jungle mid really has not been all that bad ever since Fate came in. Bot lane just makes games unwinnable, and Envy is a big part of that. Again, I considered Quantum, who came into the, league this week and, got subbed in for Ondil and was, quite frankly, just terrible for KDF. It was definitely something that was on my brain. I, moved in a different direction. I decided to go with Envy instead, but if you wanted to give Quantum dud of the week, I'm certainly not going to argue that. Hell, even Leaper could probably get dud of the week. That bot lane was terrible. So I'm going to land on Envy as dud of the week, and I'm going to land on Pays as player of the week, and that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.